Hi, I'm Jim Cates. I'm a psychologist, and this is the sixth in a series of lectures on human development. Continuing to talk about theories that primarily look at environmental influences, and looking in this lecture at social role theory. The concept behind social role theory is that social identity is formed through enactment of various social roles. And as usual, I'm going to start with a vignette. I'm going to use a vignette here. There's actually a composite of a couple of families I saw at the beginning of the 21st century, so a number of years ago now. This is fairly heavily disguised, so it will not be an accurate portrayal of any single client. But this family, for the purposes of the vignette, was seen through the Department of Child Services. The client was a 15-year-old male. Family had immigrated here from India, and they were actually referred after the boy appeared at school with a swollen jaw, and he would not explain how the bruising occurred. So DCS ended up being called because there was suspicion in the past that there had been physical abuse by the father, but no confirmation of reports. He was referred to me, the family was referred to me to do an interview and try to determine what was going on. The child never did acknowledge abuse by the father to me, but he did implicate that something had happened in the family. I ended up interviewing the family with the father, the mother, the child, and three younger sisters. They were devout Muslims, and our interview actually went across the evening prayer time. And they had brought prayer rugs, and we found a space in the office where they could have some privacy and do their evening prayers. So that was an important part of recognizing their culture. But out of all those family members, the mother was the most vocal informant. And her argument was that her husband, the boy's father, would never strike the boy because that would bring shame and dishonor on the family to strike a male child. The daughters, sure. If the daughters needed to be physically punished, he would have no problem doing that. And when I asked about striking her, she was silent. She would not talk about that. But remember, this is the early 21st century, but social identity was still strongly formed in this family by a patriarchal culture, even though they were living in a more egalitarian culture. My point is that the social roles that they brought with them really influenced who they were and who they are, at least at that point in time. So, social role theory provides a way of thinking about links between personal development and the social environment. And social roles are building blocks for any society. And there are defined positions that carry expectations for behavior by members of the group to which one belongs. Now, in the example, many of us would feel that that type of patriarchy is inappropriate, is demeaning to women, and should not exist. This isn't a class on culture, this isn't a lecture on culture. So I will leave that for another discussion about how that should be handled. But my point is that it emphasizes and highlights the way social roles impact how we interact with each other. Let's take some historical context for social role theory. Describing patterns of human behavior as social roles first emerged in several fields in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And interestingly enough, it wasn't driven by psychologists. The anthropologist Ralph Linton saw roles as a unit of culture that allowed consistency throughout a society. By holding on to roles that everyone believed in, agreed to, it allowed culture to maintain its cohesion and its consistency. And Ralph Linton was one of the first proponents of that idea. Sociologist Talcott Parsons said roles belonged to a social system, and they result in common patterns of behavior across individuals because role expectations are shared by members of the same group. And then philosopher George Herbert Mead saw role-taking as an essential socialization process for the individual in order to form self-concept. A person identifies with and internalizes the goals and values of the society, and in that way develops a sense of self. So social role learning is considered acquiring a patterned set of behaviors and an internalized understanding of how others will react to these behaviors. So social role learning becomes very important if we're going to interact effectively with other people. J.L. Moreno, the creator of psychodrama, applied this whole idea of social roles to psychodrama as a therapy technique, which is used in education and psychotherapy. But the perspective of social role theory brought a different emphasis to the whole field of human development and maturation. And by the 1950s, 1960s, the focus had moved from maturation to socialization. And scholars who were interested in adult development drew on social role theory as a way of thinking about mechanisms of change. So what are some of the key concepts that come about as we talk about social role theory? Well, first of all, there's definition of social roles. We have to have a definition there to move forward. What is a role? A role is any set of behaviors that has a social, agreed-upon function and an accepted code of norms. For example, student and professor. To some extent, I am the professional, the professor. I am providing you knowledge in doing this set of lectures, this lecture in particular. And you take the role of student. And the term role is deliberately taken from the theater. In a play, an actor's behaviors are distinct and predictable because their part follows a script. The difference is that an actor's role is a pretense. In life, roles become meaningful, become demanding, and compelling aspects of our identity. For an infant, there are few roles, and they have a socially agreed upon meaning generally. In our culture, for example, an infant has the role of child, sibling, grandchild, niece, nephew, whatever. But most of those roles are very simple as far as the infant is concerned. We assign virtually categories or labels to the infant, and they have very little to do to fulfill that role. But at successive life stages, a person acquires greater variety of roles and greater demands within those roles. So the concept of roles highlights the importance of social context in the developmental process. Let's go back to student-professor for a second. Your expectation of professor will guide how you perceive my efficacy. So, depending on what you anticipate you should be able to receive from a lecture like this, based on how you perceive the role of a professor or a professional or a psychologist who is imparting this information. That will impact how efficacious, how effective I am in providing that information to you. And in turn, my teaching will influence your view of further professors. It's not necessarily even positive or negative. I hope it's positive, but whether it's positive or negative, it will shape what you anticipate someone who's in this role will be like when they give you information. And again, that may be a hope that, my God, don't let anyone ever teach me that way again. Or it may be, that's an interesting concept, that's an interesting way to teach, that's an interesting idea. I hope somebody else builds on that. Whatever it is, it will nevertheless influence the next time someone is in a position to impart information to you, and it will influence your understanding of the role. It builds on your expectations. Likewise, your view of student will change across the time you teach, work as a school counselor, the time you're taught, whatever. Your view of your role will change, and the expectations for your role will change. If you are watching this lecture as a part of a course I'm teaching, your view of being a student will be very different than if you are an intern, or if you just happened across this and for your own desire and knowledge, you're watching it. How you view being a student viewing this video will vary dramatically. And knowledge of the functions and norms associated with any given role will influence then both the performance of the person who assumes it and the response of the network of people associated with the performer. So there's give and take. We interact and influence each other's roles in what we're doing. So what are the dimensions of social roles? Well, social roles differ along 4 specific dimensions: number of roles, intensity of involvement, time demands, and the specificity of structure. And let's talk first about number of roles. As the number increases, the person's appreciation for the social system as a whole increases. So, for example, if you are just watching this because you're interested in social role theory, and you picked out this lecture because you saw the title and you thought it would be interesting to spend a few minutes watching it, and that is the extent of our interaction, and my role as an expert on social role theory is limited to your watching this video and gaining this information, we have a very limited role interaction here. On the other hand, if you are watching this video and taking a course from me, and this video is part of that course, then my role is not just limited to this video. My role is expanded to a series of these videos. My role is expanded to the course instructor. I have many more interactions with you. I have much more involvement and investment in your education and your educational experience. And the role we play with each other is much more complex. So the investment we have in each other in the social system increases dramatically. Likewise, the intensity of the involvement. The more intense a person's role involvement is, the greater their investment of intention and energy in the role. Same thing we just talked about. If all you're doing is watching me on this one video, we don't have very intense involvement. You'll never meet me in person, probably. And your investment in what I'm talking about and who I am is minimal. On the other hand, if you're my intern, if you are being supervised by me for some reason, if you're taking a class from me, our involvement is much, much greater. And so there's a more intense personal role involvement between us, and that makes a significant difference. The greater the emotional commitment to the role, the greater anxiety about failure to meet role expectations. Again, if I'm never going to meet you, I would love for you to get something out of this video. That's part of the reason that I'm placing it somewhere where more than just students that I'm directly involved with can get something out of it. But my emotional commitment is greater to the students who take a course and see this video because I have an investment with them. My anxiety about doing a good job with them is greater than the general public. So the role that I play with those students is going to be stronger than the role with someone who just views this, and that's the only interaction we ever have. Right? So social roles vary in that way. Time demands. A time-consuming role sets up the basic structure for many daily interactions. If it's a role that's time-consuming, that involves an investment in interactions with other people on a daily basis, that's a basic structure of how the role is going to play out. That's a basic structure of how the interactions will occur. And some people find a real frustration with time-consuming, low-intensity roles. What are time-consuming, low-intensity roles? Ever worked a job which was, say, fast food, or an assembly line, or lawn care, or something else where your investment, your genuine investment in the work you were doing was minimal, but you still found it a time-consuming role to be an employee, but it was low intensity in terms of fulfillment, satisfaction. That's a time-consuming, low-intensity role. And those can be very frustrating. And yet we all, at one time or another, find ourselves in time-consuming, low-intensity roles. Specificity of structure. Some roles have actual written criteria. Some jobs we go to, we have a job outline of what's expected for us. For example, if you're taking this lecture, or if you're watching this lecture as part of a class you're taking, there's a syllabus that outlines what's expected from you. Your role as a student is fairly clearly defined in the class. My expectations as a professor teaching the class are somewhat broader. I'm expected to teach the basics of lifespan and human development, but within a very broad category. And I'm given some leeway about what I teach, how I teach it. Depending on the role, if we're parent, engineer, cashier, artist, there may be more or less structure anticipated in what we're doing. And so that goes back and forth. How specific is the structure of the role we're anticipated to do? And we talk about reciprocal roles. Reciprocal roles of student-teacher, parent-child, salesperson-customer. Each role is partly defined by the other roles that support it. So when a person enacts one role, that person learns how the person in the reciprocal role is likely to behave. And to perform a role well, it's necessary to anticipate and coordinate one's actions with those of the complementary role. Want to be a good parent? One has to figure out what the child is going to do in the child's role. Want to be a good child? Got to figure out what the parent is going to do and how to respond to the parent in their complementary role. Again, student professor, same thing. Boss employee, same thing. Norms are shared beliefs held by members of the community, and not just those involved in the role, about expectations and related behaviors. So for example, a server in a restaurant and a customer are two specific roles, but tipping in restaurants, at least in this country, is a norm. So that's a norm that exists and is kind of universally held outside of the roles. Right? In general, a pattern of increased participation in a greater number of complex roles is viewed as a normal and positive experience. So we may be a parent, but we're also an aunt or an uncle. We may also coach Little League or soccer. We may also find ourselves volunteering with a youth organization. We also may find ourselves doing different things with children in addition to being just a parent. We have different roles, complex roles, that involve us in different places in different ways. We work for a living, but we also have other activities in which we engage, which we enjoy, which place us in different roles and allow us some freedom and some sense of enjoyment. So we have different roles. We are complex. And all of that usually feels good, gives us a positive experience, but it can be stressful as well, because there are time constraints and there's competition and conflict between the demands of different roles. And parents in particular will recognize the conflict of trying to be available as parents and fulfill other roles. So we know the existence of roles, we know how roles play out. What is the contribution of changing roles to development? Well, realize there is role gain and loss across the lifespan. And there are 4 types of role changes that are especially important to the reorganization of personality. One is movement through age roles. Another is attainment of desired roles. A third is abrupt entry into new roles. And the 4th is role loss. So what is movement through age roles? Well, we can pretty much agree that successive age roles are universal. When an infant begins to toddle and crawl, when a toddler begins to develop smooth locomotion, when smooth locomotion turns into the ability to verbalize and use language effectively and begin to manipulate objects in an effective manner and handle things independently. All of these involve successive age roles in every culture. But the way in which these age roles are organized is not universal, even though universal age roles are. So development at each new life stage can be understood as adaptation to both opportunities and restrictions to the new age role. Because each age role brings a change to a person's status as well as a change in the range of behaviors that are expected. As each new age role emerges, a person acquires new skills and relinquishes earlier modes of behavior. And there is a consensus about age-appropriate behavior within a society that prods socialization and maturation. So that's how movement through age roles occurs. Again, different cultures, different societies, different historical periods, different age roles, but it's a universal process of moving through them. Attachment of desired roles. Age roles are usually connected to chronological age. And some of these roles are achieved through effort and skill. For example, status in student or professional organizations, promotions at work, the type of work one does. And as a person strives to attain desired goals, the process of reality-oriented reevaluation is going to take place. And that whole process is a reality check. Whether one succeeds or fails, one realizes what roles one can effectively take and what roles may be beyond one. And that can be devastating. It can also be incredibly rewarding. It can mean revising and looking at how one wants to achieve certain roles. It's motivating, it's discouraging, but it's all part of the process of moving through these roles. And then there's abrupt entry into some new roles. There are some life roles for which training is minimal. Taking a child to nursery school or taking a child to kindergarten, we can try to explain to a child from now until St. Swithin's Day what going to school is going to look like. But really, until we take them to their first day of nursery school, their first day of kindergarten, a child does not understand what's going to happen. That is an abrupt entry into a new role. Dating, they may have older brothers and sisters, cousins. They may have friends who have dated ahead of them, and they may have some understanding of what dating is like, but the first experience of dating is really a new experience that everyone experiences on their own. Parenting. We can talk and talk and talk about what parenting is like, but until someone becomes a parent, it's a new experience unlike anything they have done before. The other side of the life cycle, death of a spouse or a lover, death of someone who is significant to us for the first time. That's an abrupt entry into a new role. And there's no real preparation that can be done for that. The experience is the preparation. And there's generally a period of uncertainty and anxiety that comes with it. Because a lack of training, which inevitably occurs, requires drawing on inner resources to cope with uncertainty and social pressures tied to these new role positions. And hopefully, what begins as an anxiety-provoking new role stimulates an important expansion of competence. The problem is it can also turn into a helpless or self-effacing role as well. If someone is not able to draw on that expansion of competence, if someone is not able to turn to their identity and find a sense of self and ability to deal with this new role, that's where helplessness or self-effacing behavior begins to take over. We also talk about role loss. And over the lifespan, there are roles that are lost. The most dramatic, I've already mentioned, death of a spouse, death of a reciprocal role partner. What does one do? How does one function? But graduation. If you've been in school and you graduate, it's a wonderful experience to put school behind you, but it's also challenging to have that experience of being a student behind you and be in the workforce now. Divorce. Anyone who has experienced separation from a life partner or from marriage, from cohabitation, whatever. Loss of employment. Retirement. These are all transitions that result in a role loss. And they have that same anxiety-provoking experience. They stimulate, hopefully, an expansion of competence, but they can also develop into helplessness, self-effacing behavior. Okay. What are the new directions that seem to be developing from social role theory? One is gender. All cultures construct gender-differentiated roles. And these gender roles are associated with expectations to perform distinct tasks. There are access to certain resources, and different genders display certain processes and attributes. So as cultures form expectations for how men and women ought to act when they're together, the distinction between genders is fairly clearly outlined. But we consider these sex stereotypes and gender role standards that tell us what culture considers typical and admirable for genders. And we also have then basic cognitive categories that organize these social relations and influence our interpretation of these experiences. Well, in the US, obviously, gender roles have been changing over the past 50 years. But gender roles are still there. The trans movement is an example. It isn't that people, the majority of people, I should say, there's obviously gender fluid and non-binary, but the majority of people are still identifying as one gender or the other. So even though gender roles have been changing, particularly over the past 50 years, significant gender role standards still exist. And we know that children form complex gender schemes, have complex gender roles. And there are theories about cultural expectations and gender, which are directly coming out of social role theory. So that's another area where it's been useful. All right, what about the strengths and weaknesses of social role theory? Some of the strengths: it offers a way of linking the individual and the social world. Social roles and the process of social enactment suggest a mechanism for socialization and a framework for relationships and structure for adult life. Social role theory also helps explain how identity becomes fused in adulthood, how we come up with a coherent, cohesive sense of self, and how it continues to change through role gain, role loss, and integration of multiple roles. And social role theory is specific enough to offer testable hypotheses. The weaknesses of social role theory: it assumes that individuals are sufficiently attuned to the expectations of others to guide their role enactment. And it tends not to elaborate on mechanisms through which individuals learn and internalize role expectations. So it has a theory, but it doesn't have the mechanisms. It assumes societies structure themselves by roles that are agreed upon norms, expectations, and sanctions. and that there are agreed upon ways of handling people who violate these. But postmodern society has a lessening and a loosening of these expectations. So whether that really applies in postmodern society is questionable. And social roles also change as societal norms and values change. So the theory doesn't really provide an explanatory mechanism for how individuals incorporate changing norms in the society. So still some weaknesses, but social role theory takes a look at how we incorporate ourselves into the society in which we live.